In the portion we read last time, we saw that the truth that we seek to realize, the object of the spiritual knowledge, is something which is transcending the senses as well as transcending the intellect. But there is a faculty of cognition which is above intellect, a power of knowledge which is capable of knowing that. That faculty can turn to know that alone, and in the process it can turn away from the vision of the soul and the universe. Or that same faculty can turn towards the universe from that high station and see the universe the way that sees it. And here comes, he says, the most important, the most significant, all-uniting experience, which is the foundation of, he says, the deepest, integral and most intimate self-knowledge and world knowledge. And this foundation, this starting point, is to recognize that all the things in the world, seen in themselves, have no real value. And to give them importance in themselves is to lose yourself in illusion. But all things in the world have value in relation to the absolute, and it is that which gives them their present relative values. This greater truth is the reference point against which the whole world has meaning. With this as our foundation, Sri Aurobindo now looks at what exactly that vision sees when it turns to the world. And he presents this description in two different facets. The first facet is of our individual experience, and the second facet is the universal experience. So the first sentence of the paragraph we read last time says, in relation to the individual, the Supreme is our own true and highest self, that which ultimately we are in our essence, that of which we are in our manifested nature. So this is the in relation to the individual. Later, 2 pages down, he says, in relation to the universe, the Supreme is Brahman, the one reality, which is not only spiritual, material and conscious substance, etc. So these are going to be two major facets in which he is going to describe what that truth vision sees when it turns to look at soul and universe. So right now we're looking at the first facet of the soul, the individual. The truth looking down from above gives to all things their value, and in particular, in the experience of the individual soul, the values that it gives. And when we say in the individual soul, we have in our practical experience the individual soul founded in the body, the life energy, the mind, and then deeper within a spiritual essence. But all of this is our individual experience. So first, the paragraph we read last time, when that turns and looks at the individual soul experience, the way it looks at the body. And we saw that the body is not our true self, but from its perspective, it is a sensible form of the infinite. And we dwelt on that substantially. The error of the materialist idea is only to see the body, matter, the physical brain, nerve and force as the one thing and the one thing from which all else originates. These material movements, he says, are an exterior notation. These things are a language, a notation, a hieroglyph, a system of symbols, and we explored what that means also. But in the description, we saw that this body is linked to the deeper self by a connection. And this connection is of a vital force that serves to connect the self with the form of its works. And so obviously the next level of our reality will be to explore this vital energy which links the physical body to the self, which animates the physical body and gives to it its life and capacity of action. And so the next paragraph takes up this. Continuing in the same spirit, neither is the life ourself, the vitality, the energy which plays in the brain, nerves, and body. It is a power and not the whole power of the infinite. The experience of a life force instrumentalizing matter as the foundation, source, and true sum of all things, the vibrating, unsteady basis of vitalism, is a delusion, a half view taken for the whole, a tide on a near shore misconceived as all the ocean and its waters. So the vitality is now put in context in the same way as the physical body was earlier. First, he says, this life with a capital L, and it's not only the energy we feel in the body, but the energy as a reality in itself. This life is not ourself. And the vitality and energy which plays in the brain, nerves, and body is not ourself. What is it? It is a power and not the whole power of the infinite. So it is a power of the infinite. The infinite has many powers, and of all those infinite powers, being infinite, it must have an infinity of powers. Of all those infinite powers, each of which can be applied infinitely, this is one power, and not even applied infinitely. It is applied in a finite way, only for the sustenance of the brain, nerves, and body. And so, the vital experience is a delusion when it is taken in this exclusive form. And what is that exclusive form? The experience of a life force instrumentalizing matter as the foundation. The life force which gives matter its capacity is seen to be the foundation. This life force is the source and the true sum of the things. And to see the life force in this way is delusion. And we must understand that before we discard it as a delusion, it is a very useful delusion until we get to something greater. And I'll explore this a little bit. You will remember in one of the Upanishads, there is this description of a young seeker who is advised by his guru to meditate on the Brahman. And the means of realizing the Brahman is to meditate on that which is the source of all things, which is the end of all things, and it is that by which all things are sustained. And the first meditation of this young seeker leads him to the realization of matter as Brahman. He goes to his teacher, and the teacher says, yes, very good. Now go back and go deeper. He doesn't say this is wrong. This is true. This is one experience of the one perception of Brahman, one facet. The second stage of his discovery, he goes deeper and realizes that matter itself is a formation of energy. It emerges out of pure energy, it lapses back into energy, is sustained by energy in all its works. And as the modern physicist, he comes to the same conclusion that Pranam Brahman. And again the Rishi says, yes, this is good, but go back, go further, and then he comes to mind and so on. But at this point, we are looking at the experience of the whole world as originating out of energy, merging back into energy, and sustained by the energy. And it is a great vision. It has many practical implications, both in our understanding of material life as well as in our own self mastery. And before we discard it and simply say, oh, this is an illusion, we must recognize its immense utility in evolution. And that's why nature has allowed us to grow slowly through these stages. First of all, in the material world, we recognize, as modern physics goes deeper, that everything lapses back into pure energy, rhythms and whirls and movements of pure energy. E equals mc square is an obvious enough formulation, but we must go deeper, and then we see, according to current understanding of physics, a hydrogen atom is only an electron whirling around a proton, just two particles, the most simple atomic structure. It has a certain quantum of energy, locked up in the electron, locked up in the proton, and locked up in the energy of the movement. And we can calculate how much that energy is, and we're surprised it's much more than we would expect from something so insignificant. But here's the interesting part. According to the same quantum physics, especially when it is combined with the vision of relativity, we recognize that the enormous amount of empty space between these two particles is seething with what they call virtual particles, that is, pairs of electrons and anti-electrons appearing and disappearing like a huge mass of bubbles, froth, appearing and dissolving, appearing and dissolving. And if we just look at this mass of froth and measure the energy that it contains, we find that the so-called empty space and this seething virtual reality has 10 to the power 120. That means 1 followed by 120 zeros times more energy than the hydrogen atom. Now, this is such a huge number. It is unimaginable to the human mind. It is more than all the energy of all the atoms put together. It is such a huge number that the appearance of the atom itself seems like something insubstantial compared to the mass of energy. It's as if, in an analogy, one could say, you take the whole ocean of the earth and a tiny, not even a drop, but a microscopic bit out of a drop, and that's all that the whole ocean is expressing itself in. It seems a little ridiculous. And there's nothing else to counter this humongous energy. Why at all this energy represents itself in such a fragile and insignificant expression of the hydrogen atom? And this is the case for the whole universe. And the scientists are at a loss to explain this. You will remember the line from Savitri. This whole universe, he says, a small result of a stupendous force. And this is that small result which we are seeing. What is that stupendous force doing? And if we could experience that, enter into its pure energetic reality as distinct from the materiality of its expression, we would find this enormous world and gradations of this enormous world against which matter is so trivial, fickle, almost insubstantial, almost unreal. Such is the character of this life, this vitality, this energy of which a tiny part plays in the brain and nerves and the body, sustaining our material life. So it is a power and not the whole power of the infinite. And this force we can obviously see in relation to matter is the origin of matter, is the foundation, the source, and the true sum of all things. Obviously. And this is such a great vision. In practical understanding of matter, what this means is all of our physics, if it could simply turn to this recognition of this greater power and the means by which this power manifests to become matter, we would be able to resolve practically all our problems of life and be able to tap into this power at will in any quantity, anywhere, almost effortlessly. We would be able to draw out of it matter, materialize substance of any kind, dematerialize, teleport, anything is possible. We wouldn't need to dig into mines. We could create any substance we need, simply drawing it out of this enormous energy. So the implications for physics are enormous. Implications for the human being are equally enormous. That if we could allow more of this energy to flow into the brain, the nerves, and the body, all of our capacities, current capacities, would be so enormously amplified. We touched upon this briefly last time, that the sense of aging is really a sense of the weakening of life energy. So tapping into this source, and there is so much we now understand, tapping into it, even a tiny fraction of it, means we could do literally anything, not only in our individual capacity, but channeling that energy through us, we could cast it into form. A tiny bit of that energy flowing through us, we could materialize substance at will. And not just a few little nuggets of metallic substance as some of the magicians do, but enormous cities could be materialized at will if only we channeled ourselves, used ourselves as a channel for a drop of this enormous force to manifest itself in material terms. So just in terms of matter, this huge amount of energy, life force, has such a great place, such an important place. Literally, it allows matter to exceed all its limitations. It allows the full freedom of life force to play out through the vehicle of material form to achieve, to attain, to create anything. So, the experience of a life force instrumentalizing matter as the foundation, source, and true sum of all things, this, he says, is a delusion. But it is a delusion when we have to go to something greater. But he describes this life force now in terms of its limitations, and that is the vibrating, unsteady basis of vitalism is a delusion. Contrasting with matter, matter has this character of being stable. It is literally the domain of persistence of form. Compared to that, life force is the very opposite. It is always in agitation, always in vibration, always unstable. It cannot be bound. The only way to bind life force is to make it whirl in a circle. And then you have as if the life force bound in a little space, but it's not really bound, it has to keep moving. If you stop the energy from moving, immediately it dissipates, it vanishes. One can even say its nature is movement. This is the reason why, when dealing with anything of the vital energies, we cannot hold them back. Now, this applies for the life force in us. If we simply try to accumulate life force in us, it just dissipates, or after a while it dulls, weakens, and just fades out. It has to be moved into activity. And the moment we move it to action, it grows in intensity. The same applies when we deal with money, for example, which is a material expression of life force. Money stored, put in a box and filed away, hidden away, weakens, loses power. On the other hand, when it is applied, invested, or put to use, it grows by rotation. So this is the character of life energy. It is vibrating, unsteady, basis of vitalism. And to see this as the foundation, source, and true sum of things is a delusion, a half view taken for the whole. So, what is the whole view? And he gives one of those very powerful images, and always an image like this must be explored more fully. The image is not mere poetic image. A tide on a near shore, misconceived as all the ocean and its waters. So let's explore this image. There are at least three major facets to it. When we stand on the edge of the ocean is out there. But every now and then the waters extend until they surround us and then they draw back. And this is the movement of the tide. The tide is defined by this movement. Remove the movement and there is no tide. So life force, similarly, is like this tide of the ocean. The ocean is the true basis, the true foundation of all things. But of that ocean, there is a tide, some part that is in a constant movement, defined by the movement. Second facet to it is that it is an edge. It is not the thing, it is not the depth of the thing in itself. It is an outermost edge, and yet it is the water moving back and forth. It is the ocean moving back and forth, but just the edge of it. So to that extent, the life energy of vital energy, life force, is a power, not the whole power of the infinite. But it is a power which is already on the edge in a movement as in the tide. Third facet to this description is, in a sense, it represents the ocean. It is the only part of the ocean that we can safely relate to without getting overwhelmed. If we were to walk into the ocean too deep, we would be drowned. We would lose our individuality. It is the edge of the ocean that we are able to relate to, that is the interface between the infinity of the ocean and the finiteness of our forms. So it is a very important interface, representative of the ocean, and yet we must always remind ourselves, not the whole ocean. So, a half view taken for the whole, a tide on a near shore misconceived as all the ocean and its waters. The error would be to say this is all the ocean and all the water. There's another suggestion, a tide on a near shore. So even in the shore, there are further reaches we could go into. In the physical image of it, we can walk into the water of the ocean, and there are degrees where suddenly the ground goes deeper and deeper. But still we could call them shore, close enough to the shore. But there's a point beyond which suddenly the ground falls, and it falls to a great depth, and that they call the continental shelf. So there comes a point in the spiritual journey to the source of things that suddenly there is a breakthrough beyond which we do not have any more the sense of a base, a familiar base of matter. But until quite a long distance, there are degrees of depth. So the near shore is the most surface, superficial part where the ground is shallow, the material formal reality is still very close. And upon that, the life energy is playing, but far beyond is the real foundation, source, and true sum of things. The vitalist idea takes something powerful but outward for the essence. So the vitalist idea, we have to understand this was written about 100 years ago. And there was a context to this phrase, vitalist. It was a time when in much of Europe especially, but all over the world, there was a sudden interest in things occult. We may say it was a resurgence of occult exploration in preparation for a deeper search for spiritual things, perhaps. But it was a time when much of this occultism had again come into common interest, and a lot of experiments were being made, sometimes loosely and even dangerously. Many of the first explorers of this domain found that they could achieve so much by the use of this vital energy. They could even perform near miracles, they could heal, they could cure, they could do so many things. This occult exploration of vitalism was paralleled in the domain of physics with the sudden discovery of matter being pure energy. And in a practical form, this meant the ability to tap into pure energy in the form of electricity or heat, or later on even in the atomic release, the atomic power being released. And so there was a whole domain of exploration of electricity especially happening at that time, which was seen as a vital fluid by those explorers. So there was a very interesting mix from the occult to the physical, and the bridge point was electrical. And many of the occultists were playing with electricity and high voltages as a way of channeling that life force in material terms. At the same time, the physicists were using electricity as a way of reviving the body, giving it a greater boost of energy, and so on, because they sensed this connection. And it is in this context that we must understand the vitalism and the age of vitalism and the vitalist idea. The physicist said, with electricity we can do anything. I recently came across a news clipping of 1919. This was just after, towards the end of the First World War, where Nikola Tesla, one of the great masters of electricity, states that we can do so much now with electricity. We can solve all the problems of humanity with electricity. And how? And he says with electricity, we can precipitate nitrates from the air into ground and fertilize any soil, turn the desert into forest. With the same electricity, you can create large lakes in the middle of a desert just by provoking the clouds to condense. With the same electricity, you can travel at great distances at a great height very fast. And so, in this way, everything in human life would be revolutionized, and the one solution was mastering electricity. At the same time, on the other side, the occultists, they said, with this power of vitalism, we can heal all illnesses, we can control the weather, we can materialize objects, we can see into the future, we can change things, we can change minds, we can influence people. Everything is possible. And this was an age where the vital energy was seen as supreme and solution to all things. So the vitalist idea takes something powerful but outward for the essence. And it's a fact, this is a great power. But it is a very outward part of the truth of things. The essence is much further. That's the only error they make. Life force is the dynamization of a consciousness which exceeds it. This is the great next step for the exploration of physics, which perhaps may not happen very soon though. When they said matter is energy, they still couldn't figure out why energy works in this way. What is the nature of energy? And here is the definition of energy. Life force is the dynamization of a consciousness which exceeds it. Consciousness dynamizing itself is energy, but that consciousness is enormously larger. If the energy which inhabits the space of the empty space of an atom is 10 to the power 120 times greater than the energy of the atomic substance, the consciousness behind that energy is something even greater. That consciousness is felt and acts, but does not become valid to us in intelligence until we arrive at the higher term of mind, our present summit. So now, having experienced energy, having played with it, we want to move to the consciousness behind, of which it is a dynamization. And that consciousness we can feel. Its action we can feel, and perhaps we can even wield, but we are not able to feel it, we are not able to access and apply it until we arrive at what he says, the higher term of mind, our present summit. So our present summit being mind, mind itself has a long range, and in that long range, the higher term is where we are able to get to that consciousness. Mind is here apparently a creation of life, but it is really the ulterior sense, not the ultimate, of life itself and what is behind it, and a more conscious formulation of its secret. Mind is an expression not of life, but of that of which life itself is a less luminous expression. So now the relationship between life and mind is put in context before he moves to the discussion of mind itself. So since we are still in the discussion of life, we must see first life in terms of mind. Sorry, we must see mind in terms of life, because life is our theme. So apparently, from the perspective of life, mind is a creation of life. Where did mind come from in evolution? As a process of the life energy working in the brain and the nerves. First, life energy was in the body. Nerves were only incidental. Then the nervous system became more complex until it specialized into this brain structure. And then in this complex working of the nervous system, which is the working of life force, awareness grew, developed until mind formed. So mind as if emerged out of life force as a process of life, even as a creation of life. So he says mind is here apparently a creation of life. But it is really the ulterior sense of life itself and what is behind it. So what is the true nature of mind? Life has an ulterior sense, not the ultimate. So there is an ulterior motive, ulterior objective of life itself, and that is the movement towards mind. But it's not yet the ultimate. The ultimate is spirit. But this ulterior movement of life is mind, but much more, life and mind are both expressions of something greater behind, which uses life to provoke mind. So, and what is behind it, and a more conscious formulation of its secret. So the secret of life formulating itself more consciously, becoming more self-aware, that is mind. But only to the extent that we see mind emerging out of life. The fact is, mind is an expression not of life, but of that which life itself, of which life itself is a less luminous expression. So we see behind them all something trying to manifest which organized life and which organizes mind. But in mind it is more clearly self-aware, in life it is less luminous. So the smoky flame is life, the clear light is mind in the Vedic imagery. What is that thing? That we will come to shortly. But now the next paragraph takes up mind. Seen now from that highest, the absolute, looking at matter, life, mind, giving to them its values and giving them meaning and purpose. We have seen it gives to matter a special meaning. It is sensible form of the infinite. It gives to life a special purpose. It is the power which dynamizes things on its behalf, the edge of its own greater power. And now mind. And yet mind also, our mentality, our thinking, understanding part, is not ourself. It is not that, not the end or the beginning. It is a half light thrown from the infinite. So remember the description we had earlier in questing for the Brahman, that which is the origin of things, that which is the culmination of things, that by which all things are sustained. So he says, mind also is not the end or the beginning. There is something else behind which uses mind. And yet, at the first glance, it seems as if mind is the beginning and the end of all things, even of life and of matter. And again, I refer to the ultimate edge of the physicist's exploration, where he ceases to be a physicist and becomes a metaphysicist. And the statements of great physicists come to this finally, that the only way we can understand this working of energy and the particular formulae along which everything seems to work out is that there is a great conception behind an idea which holds the reality together, of which these formulae represent its conception. So one of the great physicists whose name I cannot now recall, he says the world is beginning to appear less and less like a machine, more and more like a great idea. So it is as if the idea of God, which is world, and that idea energizes itself and appears to us in material form. But the reality is idea. So it is a great experience. It is a great truth. In fact, when we come to looking at the exploration the same way as we saw vitalism, when we come to this dimension of human mastery and self-mastery, we recognize that to be able to wield life force, to be able to cast matter into form by the power of life force, you must have developed a great power of conception. Because our minds are still not too much better than children's minds, we are not able to do what otherwise is naturally possible for a highly developed human being. So, just as a few examples, the rishis, for example, could, by the power of the word, invoke or create or change something of reality in a dramatic way. We have known also of great sages even in modern times who, casting a mantra, could immediately cause a result, sometimes on a massive scale. In one example, in the life of Vasishtha Ganapati Muni, if I recall rightly, I don't know if I recall the details rightly, but there was a fire, some buildings were on fire, and he immediately invoked the mantra of fire to put it out. At other times, similarly, we know of people who caused rain to form in a trice sometimes. We have also legends which, because they sound so abnormal, so impossible, we put them in the domain of legends and myths. But they are very much a part of human history, where overnight large structures were erected, buildings made, cities created by the craftsmen of the gods. And these kinds of creations are in fact possible to the human mind if it were to be developed sufficiently. For example, in the emerging from the examples I took from the vitalist's view, if we wanted to create something great here, right now, a sculpture of substance which is unusual, let's take the purest form of marble or metal, or something which would be almost impossible, metal etched into the marble, and that would be very difficult to do with current technology. The metal itself we could conceive of in terms of alloys which are almost impossible to create. If we had the access to that energy, yes, we could materialize it, but the materialization would be dependent on your capacity to conceive. You would have had to have a mind which can conceive in the tiniest detail the full image in 3 dimensions, inside out, and hold that image and then infuse into that image the necessary energy, condensing it and materializing it, and the thing would be available right there physically. In the past, certain creations were made like this. In the future, there will be a common way of creating things which are currently difficult to create. But the point I'm getting at is, mind is still the key for mastering the energy. And so, recognizing this power of the mind, we could make the error of saying, yes, our mentality is the source of things, is the beginning, is the power, is the essential truth. Of course, we can say our thinking is nowhere near. So Sri Aurobindo starts with this. Our mentality, our thinking, understanding part is not ourself, is not that, not the end or the beginning. It is a half light thrown from the infinite. So now, seeing from the vision of the absolute, we have seen where it places the body, where it places life energy, and mind now is a half light. Before its full light can be thrown on the world, it is a half light preparing for the full light. The experience of mind as the creator of forms and things, and of these forms and things existing in the mind only, the thin, subtle basis of idealism, is also a delusion, a half view taken for the whole, a pale refracted light idealized as the burning body of the sun and its splendor. So again, in the spirit of the earlier 2 paragraphs, something which is here discarded as a delusion, but which has a tremendous value in the evolution until we seek to go beyond it. And what it is, creator of forms and things. And of these forms and things existing in the mind only. And we must explore both these facets. In fact, this is the great conclusion of Buddhism in the most practical form in which it relates to the world. It sees that all things which exist are created by mind. And ultimately they exist only in the mind. If you change your mind, the whole experience of reality changes. So practically, you say, oh, because of these situations, I am suffering, I am in pain. But that's because you look at things in a certain viewpoint. Where is that pain? Where is that suffering? Well, it's in your mind. Where is the thing which is causing the pain? It's not out there. It is in your perception that you see it this way. Tomorrow suddenly I receive a different report that says, oh, please ignore the previous report, that was a mistake. These are the actual facts. Oh, wonderful. Instead of losing the lottery, I won it. And the same thing which caused me pain now is causing me great joy. So what is the reality of that thing out there? Its only reality is in the way you have registered it. Third, what is it that links that experience with the pain that you have? The causal connection is also in your mind. Why should the fact that you have lost money here cause you pain and suffering? Because your mind associates this with that. You could simply say, oh, I lost money, and have no other result. It has no implication for happiness or sadness. You have made a connection in your mind. So it is in your mind that you have a cause, a causal effect, and the effect being pain, pleasure, or whatever other, and it's all there only in your mind. Now, if in my mind I say, I don't want to have it this relationship, I don't want to view the world in this way, and I say, well, I lost money. Oh, that was a very interesting lesson. I learned now not to do this. I learned how not to do something. and I move forward, and I can change completely my whole perception of the world. So the first training that is given to the Buddhist is find the correction in your own consciousness, in your own mind, so that the problem of the world is solved. But there's a still deeper truth to this vision. And here we have to go still deeper in the way we experience the world. There is a famous story in the Buddhist tradition. Two great monks were discussing. Observing a flag waving, the first one said, "It is the wind which waves the flag." The second said, "No, it is the flag which waves in the wind." And they were arguing over and over, looking for which is the cause, which is the effect. And then this third person comes. As the story goes, he is a great master in disguise. And he comes and says, "You're both wrong. Neither the flag is waving nor the wind is waving. It is the mind which waves." And this statement which he gave was heard by another, the head of the monastery, and he recognized in him a great master and so on. But if you think about it, there's a deep truth to this. The flag is there. The movement that you see has no reality except in your perception of it. And in your perception of it, the flag is not an object, it is only an idea of object. The wind is not an object, it is only idea of object. The movement also is not real, it is only idea of movement. So ultimately it is because your mind is in activity, in movement, waving, that the whole universe is registered to you as in movement. And there is a status of mind in which you can be in a state of complete silence in which everything simply is. Not static, it appears to be in movement, but the movement is not a real movement. Even as in a cinema, you see this person lift a glass of water and drink from it, but the reality is not a movement. There are a series of images, the hand like this, like this, series of jerking motions, jerking images, none of which are moving. The movement is only in your mind. Having seen this series of pictures, each of which is fixed, your mind constructs the sense of a smooth movement. In reality, nothing moved. The light shone, one picture. The light shone, another picture. The light shone, another picture. Even the light did not move, it only lit up. Mother refers to this in one of her classes. She says there is an experience, a very high experience, in which we can experience the entire universe extinguished and recreated at each moment. There is no continuity truly. This moment is there, extinguished. Another moment is there, extinguished. And another moment. And there is no continuity. The movement of the wind or the flag or even this real life glass that I lift and drink is all in your mind. There is actually no movement out there. The Buddhist comes to this experience. It is considered one of the highest experiences in the training, where he actually sees the whole universe extinguished and recreated at each moment. And there are only moments, there is no continuity of time in that experience. There are also other experiences. So we can even say that it is the mind which is the creator of the forms and things. And all of these forms and things exist only in our mind, not this human mind, but capital M. We may even give to this mind a cosmic character, in a cosmic mind, because cosmic mind sees cosmos, therefore we experience cosmos being part of cosmic mind. Because cosmic mind chooses to see itself in terms of these rhythms, we see these rhythms as laws of the world, of the universe, of physics, and so on. But there is nothing except mind's perception of these things. They don't exist in themselves. There is only mind. And if you extinguish this mind, there is nothing, emptiness. And so the Buddhist says, emptiness is the source of all things, emptiness is the culmination of all things, the basis of things, and so on. But this experience, mind as the creator of forms and things, and these forms and things existing in the mind only, is also a delusion. And the Buddhist reading this would say, yes, this is so true, because behind it is the emptiness. But we have seen this statement now in various perspectives, in these two visions of the which I described from the Buddhist tradition, but also from the physical perspective. It is mind, and perhaps cosmic mind, but also individual mind, which can materialize forms. And to the extent that mind can conceive and energize, all forms can be materialized, cast or recast. If our mind was sufficiently powerful, it could take a lump of sand, hold it in the hand, and transmute it into any substance that it wants, wield it into any shape, take a piece of metal and bend it, shape it to whatever it wants effortlessly, because that is the power actually of mind. So we can say, and very practically, materially, mind is creator of forms and things. And then we have these higher gradations, more abstract, which I described later from the Buddhist experience. And then he says one more, the thin, subtle basis of idealism. Mind as the thin, subtle basis of idealism. That is also a delusion. But delusion, when we see that as the basis of all these things, the truth is there is something else of which mind is the instrument. So what is mind in fact? A pale refracted light, idealized as the burning body of the sun and its splendor. It is a half view taken for the whole. So the sun's light refracted, it has got bent. It is not even the direct light, it has got bent. And this bending is very important, because from a certain perspective we can say everything is divine. So everything that happens is also according to the divine's will. Therefore, when things go wrong, you can blame the divine. But obviously that's not true. It's a false logic. Everything is essentially divine, but not divine in the form in which it is expressed. Why? Because the essence, by the time it enters into domain of form, has been distorted, twisted, mixed, darkened, refracted. The light, which was a straight ray of the truth, has been bent. When it is bent, it still has the characteristic of the ray of truth. But when you have from the sun these million rays of truth, and they flow out in perfect harmony with each other, no two rays cross each other. Each serves a unique purpose, and yet all of them together are complete, and they never conflict. But the moment you refract a ray, it is still a ray of the sun, but now it conflicts with all other rays. See, it's a very interesting image. And this is the nature of mind's understanding, mind's truth. It still receives the light from the supermind, but when it gets refracted, you have fragments, and all the fragments are in conflict and in chaos with each other. So just this one word suggests so much. A pale refracted light. It's also been darkened substantially, so you do not see the pure light of the truth. Darkened, refracted, and then that we idealize as the burning body of the sun and its splendor. This idealist vision also does not arrive at the essence of being, does not even touch it, but only an inferior mode of nature. Mind is the dubious outer penumbra of a conscious existence which is not limited by mentality but exceeds it. So now he is defining mind as it is seen from that highest station by the higher vision. Mind is the dubious outer penumbra of a conscious existence. So this conscious existence has a penumbra, and the penumbra itself has many degrees, and that outer edge, which is already vague enough to be dubious, that's what mind is. Penumbra, the word again suggests something very interesting. It is a part of the light which reaches, and only the outer edge of the light, and that also through a reflection. So when we say, for example, the lunar eclipse takes place, there is the moon's shadow, and on the outer edge of the shadow, there is a larger shadow, and that is the penumbra. The center is the umbra, the shadow proper, where everything is dark, and around it, this lightened shadow. And this light is coming from the edge of the sun that's peeking out from behind the moon. So part of the light and the edge of the sun, not even the center, from that edge, a part of the light which reaches you, that creates this vague shadow. And this is the nature of mind. It is the shadow of conscious existence which is not limited by mentality but exceeds it. It is an existence. It is a consciousness. It is self-aware, just as mind is, but of a completely different order. The method of the traditional way of knowledge, eliminating all these things, arrives at the conception and realization of a pure conscious existence, self-aware, self-blissful, unconditioned by mind, life and body, and to its ultimate positive experience, that is Atman, the self, the original and essential nature of our existence. So this is the traditional approach to the yoga of knowledge. It arrives at this. Here at last there is something centrally true, but in its haste to arrive at it, this knowledge assumes that there is nothing between the thinking mind and the highest. Shutting its eyes in samadhi, tries to rush through all that actually intervenes without even seeing these great and luminous kingdoms of the spirit. Perhaps it arrives at its object, but only to fall asleep in the infinite. Or if it remains awake, it is in the highest experience of the Supreme into which the self-annulling mind can enter, but not in the Supreme of the Supreme, Paratpara. So we are now looking at the limitations of the method of traditional knowledge as well as its strength. So its strength is that it arrives at something which is centrally true. But in its haste, it has missed out everything else. So what's the method of the traditional knowledge to arrive at that? Eliminating all these things, body, life and mind, in the way we saw, in the sequence we saw. Eliminating all these things, it arrives at the conception and after that realization of pure conscious existence. So first we conceive of a pure conscious existence. And since mind is the vehicle for arriving at knowledge, it starts with the conception of the mind. That conception in the beginning is necessarily flawed. But dwelling on it, gradually the mind begins to come in relation with the truth behind, and bit by bit that light reaches down to touch the mind. The flawed conception gradually gives way to a touch of the experience. And when the experience touches it, what is it touching? A pure conscious existence, self-aware, self-blissful, unconditioned by mind, life and body. So in the first approach, when there is a touch of that experience, it often follows this sequence: self-aware, first a pure existence, conscious, self-aware, and then self-blissful. So we feel something. There is something, a presence. It exists. And even we begin to feel that it is conscious, we begin to feel that it is super conscious, and as if a part of us approaching it begins to share in that super conscious awareness. We do not yet at first experience its self awareness. We feel ourselves losing awareness as we begin to enter it. It's a kind of a vague, unformed awareness to us. But gradually, as we settle into it more and more, a new kind of awareness begins to awaken in us, and we feel ourselves in that self aware. And only later we begin to feel the bliss of it, self blissful. But right from the beginning, we can feel it is completely unaffected by what happens in body, life, and mind, unconditioned. And then to this mind, there can be two facets to that experience. It can know that by negation, not this, not this, not this, and get into a kind of a emptiness, which is the Buddhist realization, or in the more Vedantic form, it is a positive recognition. So he says, to its ultimate positive experience, that is Atman, the self, the original and essential nature of our existence. But the haste to arrive at it, this knowledge assumes that there is nothing between the thinking mind and the highest. Buddhe paratastu saha. Buddhe parata, beyond the buddhi, transcending buddhi, is that. In the way Sri Aurobindo describes this elsewhere, in the Life Divine in particular, we can see it this way in terms of a picturing. All things are an expression of self. We can conceive of self as above, as the origin in a vertical ascension, but we could also conceive self immanent. We could conceive self transcending, and therefore it is as if all around. When we approach the transcending self, from wherever we are in our current evolution, we can as if break out of the form and enter in relation to the self directly, without ascending the levels. So in the material consciousness, in a material sensory experience, one can as if break out of the senses, break out of materiality, and experience a kind of an underlying presence of self. At first it would necessarily be the part of the self as reflected in the body consciousness. Similarly, in the life energy, one can break out as if into a massive presence of energy, supporting the energy, behind energy, transcending the energy, but expressing itself in terms of energy. And similarly, one would be at that point registering the self as reflected in life force. In mind, similarly, even in the character of the mind that we currently have, which is a mind functioning in distinctions, in facets, dividing, breaking up into forms, one could similarly break out as if into perception of self. But Sri Aurobindo says, at each of these gradations, the experience of the self itself is different. And if we were to ascend into a higher range of the mind itself, we would perceive self differently at each of those levels. So it is possible to experience self as something transcending the intellect, buddhe paratastu saha. And then, if we seek it as transcending self, and we have the conception that all our mental functioning is a reflected light, refracted light from the self, and we direct all the energies of mind to that in a single intense focus, he says, shutting its eyes in samadhi, tries to rush through all that actually intervenes without even seeing these great and luminous kingdoms of the spirit. And then there's a kind of a breakthrough, transcending everything. So perhaps it arrives at its object, but only to fall asleep in the infinite. What is meant by this is, of course, to the human experience, nothing remains of that glimpse. I've shared with this some years ago. I've shared here an experience which was narrated by a Vedantic seeker who attended a retreat of a Buddhist master, Chan master Shengyen. It took place in New York, and he wrote out his experience there. They were for many days continuously in intense meditation. Obviously, this man had prepared himself through many years of sadhana. But with the master, there's the advantage that he can imprint his own experience on the disciple easily. So they were in that, and he found himself repeatedly approached by the master and goaded to push further. And he said they had reached a point where they were meditating continuously 6 hours at a time. And at some stage in the meditation, it's as if he suddenly broke out into this tremendous bliss. It was an extraordinary, blissful experience, transcending the mind, very beautiful, something of the Satchidananda experience. And at that point, the master immediately recognized that this person had broken through to that level. He came up to him in the break and said, "You must not stop here, you must go further, you must go beyond." And then this man narrates how the next day, it's as if he rejected this experience of bliss, seeking something still further. And then he said it was as if he was in a blank after that, because he has no memory of what happened. He was in that blank, unremembered state for the complete 6 hours. And then he emerged from it only with the sense that he had been somewhere in some state which is indescribable, but unable to recollect anything of that experience, because obviously it was indescribable. But from the human perspective, from the human experience, its value is equivalent to having gone to sleep. A different kind of sleep, a sleep of transcendence perhaps. So perhaps it arrives at its object, but only to fall asleep in the infinite. And there's nothing from there linking anymore to here, and so the entire memory or experience of that is gone, lost. Or if it remains awake, it is in the highest experience of the Supreme into which the self-annulling mind can enter, but not in the Supreme of the Supreme, Paratpara. So if you try somehow not to lose yourself in that experience, recall, retain some kind of a registering awareness which can stay with you, or at least the memory of which can stay with you, then he says that awake can be only in the highest experience of the Supreme into which the self-annulling mind can enter. So mind, as it approaches to this edge, because it's in the mind that the registration is taking place, approaching this edge, annulling itself, there's a point at which it can register the Supreme Consciousness while still remaining in this mind on the border, on the edge. But it is not the way the Supreme knows itself, the Supreme of the Supreme, Paratpara. The mind can only be aware of the self in a mentalized spiritual thinness, only of the mind reflected Satchidananda. Looking at the whole universe from the integral perspective, everything is coterminous with everything else. Where is the Satchidananda? Right here. Where is the mental world? Right here. Where is the supramental world? right here. They are only gradations, degrees, which are so distant from each other that there is as if no interaction. In fact, there is interaction, but very thin, veiled. And there are many veils also intended to prevent or reduce the interactions. So, if all is everywhere, each can be in touch with everything else directly. So there is a part of our body, for example, which is in direct relation to life force. There's a part of the body which is in direct relation to the mind bypassing life force. There's a part of the life force which is in relation to the mind, having nothing to do with the body. But there's a part of the life force which is in relation to the mind, which also is relating to the body. And so on, every possible permutation and combination of these 7 gradations is in fact existent. The only question is, in our human personal organization of the individuality, the parts which could respond to the Satchidananda have not yet been organized. But in fact, right now, matter is directly in relation to the Satchidananda. But the nature of the relationship is of isolation, not direct action to manifest. So in the human being also, we speak of 5 bodies traditionally: the gross physical, vital, mental. And then above that, there is the causal body and then the bliss body, which are half formed, just barely as an outline, vaguely formed enough that our mind can turn to those things within its domain, at least with idea. Of things beyond that, even we cannot have the conception or idea, because nothing is formed. So the whole of further evolution can be described in these terms as these 2 higher bodies becoming more organized and mind integrating itself with these higher levels more and more and organizing them in itself. Eventually, the life energy in us relating to those levels and organizing them in it, and finally the physical substance relating to those levels, responding to them and organizing them in itself, and that would be the physical transformation. So if you look at it in these terms, the whole question becomes very simple. Mind can enter in relation to everything, including Satchidananda and even otherwise. But in the part of the mind which responds to it, and which part? Mind can only be aware of the self in a mentalized spiritual thinness only of the mind reflected Satchidananda. In the part of the mind which is very thin, very vague, not very formed and organized, in that part there is a mind reflected Satchidananda, and in this part you can become aware of the self. As long as you are in the mind. The highest truth, the integral self-knowledge, is not to be gained by this self-blinded leap into the absolute, but by patient transit beyond the mind into the truth consciousness, where the infinite can be known, felt, seen, experienced in all its fullness, in all the fullness of its unending riches. So this is the great difference. In the traditional knowledge, in the traditional path, the human being is imaged as a mountain, the peak of which is the mind, the self is the sun, and the light of the sun now lights up the peak of the mountain, the mind. That's all you can do. From this peak to the sun is this huge gap. You leap to lose yourself in self. What can self do to the mountain? Not much except light it up. What can mountain do to the self? Well, it can clear up the clouds to be able to reflect the light better. And the two shall never meet. What Sri Aurobindo is saying here is that's because we skipped the intervening levels. And in the intervening levels, if we are not self-blinded in that leap, then we find that there are gradations. A patient transit beyond the mind into the truth consciousness where the infinite can be known. So rather than leaping directly into the absolute, losing yourself in it, or reflecting that in this rarefied part of the mind, we rise above mind to truth consciousness, which can know that and which can know this and retain the consciousness of that while here. And this is the supramental part of the integral yoga. The infinite can be known because that thing is a power of the infinite, is itself the infinite in the power of self-knowledge. When the infinite says, I want to know myself, the power by which it knows itself is supermind. And therefore that is the one power in the whole cosmos which can know infinite as infinite knows itself. And that power is just above the mind. And so instead of leaping across, we rise into this power first, where the infinite can be known, felt, seen, experienced in all the fullness of its unending riches. And so again, degrees of first something of the mental consciousness, knowing, I know the infinite, but still it is different from me. It grows in intimacy, and then you feel the presence of the infinite. And then you rise into that consciousness, and then you begin to see and begin to share in its seeing of itself. And then eventually you settle there and become a part of it and experience it in all its fullness of its unending riches. And there we discover this self that we are, and there we discover this self that we are to be not only a static, tenuous, vacant Atman, but a great, dynamic spirit, individual, universal, and transcendent. So far, because you could know self only by its reflection in the mind, you had this very limited, vague, and blinding experience. But from this station, you can know this self that we are to be, not as a static, tenuous, vacant Atman, but a great, dynamic spirit. So there is a spirit, a great, powerful, moving, dynamic spirit, which has three statuses: individual, universal, and transcendent. And this is very different from the static, tenuous, vacant Atman. And this is where again we have the difference from the Buddhist realization and Vedantic realization on the one side, and Sri Aurobindo's formulation of the ultimate reality. That self and spirit cannot be expressed by the mind's abstract generalizations. All the inspired descriptions of the seers and mystics cannot exhaust its contents and its splendors. On the one hand, a statement like this makes us feel, what's that? It's something vague, it's like a platitude, something wonderful which we can never know, almost unreal in its wonder. On the other hand, we realize that if that thing is so wonderful that all the descriptions of the seers and mystics cannot exhaust its contents and its splendors, and that means each one of us, as we relate to it, enter it, and experience it, will discover its unending wonders and splendors uniquely, I would even say differently, because it is infinite and all the descriptions would not exhaust it. So therefore, the moment you experience it, you will discover it and experience it in a way which is so different from the others, so wonderfully unique and distinct. And yet you will understand all those descriptions of those others, the seers and mystics. And that's what makes it so wonderful. That each one of us, although realizing the same infinite self and spirit, knowing each other's and recognizing each other's experience of that same self and spirit, would still experience it differently enough that we would have something to share with all the others. And so, in a realization, a collective realization of this self and spirit, it would not be, oh, we all have it, therefore there's nothing else left to do, nothing to share, nothing to express. Rather, there is an ending possibility, unending riches and splendor to share, and each one of us uniquely, in a way that we can exchange with each other and learn from each other, although we are still in the same one, self and spirit. And this is the promise for the future, not only in terms of individual experience and collective experience, but in terms of what we are able to cast out from our experience into form of life, manifest and organize in mind, in life energy, and even in matter, which are all vehicles for its self-expression, which it has created for its self-expression. So you will recall in the portion we read last time, he says, seen from that higher knowledge, when it looks down at mind, life, and body, we find that the ignorance of the mind and the senses and all the apparent futilities of human life were not a useless excursion of the conscious being, an otiose blunder. Here, they were planned as a rough ground for the self-expression of the soul that comes from the infinite, a material foundation for its self-unfolding and self-possessing in the terms of the universe. And so as we begin to experience that and manifest that, that self now uses this material foundation for its self-unfolding. That means all of that riches which belong and are experienced in that domain of self are intended to be manifested in terms of matter, mind, life, and matter, self-unfolding and self-possessing. That is, each time we relate to things in the universe, that is relating to itself in innumerable colors of delight and bliss and play. When we enjoy the perfume of a flower, when we enjoy the delicacy of a food, when we enjoy a relationship with human beings, animals, plants, objects, in each of these, it intends to discover itself and possess itself in terms of the universe, even as it is unfolding its unending riches. It possesses them, plays and enjoys them. So such is the nature of the future which has to unfold. And so this description, although for us it may be a little inaccessible or even frustrating, it is a promise for the wonder that is inevitable in our own future. That self and spirit cannot be expressed by the mind's abstract generalizations. All the inspired descriptions of the seers and mystics cannot exhaust its contents and its splendors. So this is the vision when we approach the Supreme in terms of the individual. When we approach the same Supreme in relation to the universe, then there is this experience or this seeing of the whole universe as a field of manifestation. And that description we will see next time, which will be next Friday. I think we can pause here and take up any questions or anything you want to share. That description is specific to trying to understand the working of the Divine Mother. So if you try to follow with your mind, then you will not be able to follow. But if with the deeper soul one opens oneself to her, then she reveals, and in the soul's knowing that can be perceived, or in the intuition's working it can be understood. So that description is very specific to understanding and knowing the ways of the Divine Mother in her working in the world. because it is too complex, too multifaceted and rapid for the mind to follow. But that's why he says you have to know it from the soul or the intuition. Then only we can. And she will reveal, she will give us also the capacity to perceive.
All this capacity, what you just now described,
yes,
that she will do. That
I don't think that passage applies directly to this description, but we could take it as a principle that as we open our mind and life and even the body consciousness to her force, she will organize here the means by which these can become conscious vehicles for the divine will to act. So we can take that as a general principle that she will reveal and develop in us that capacity. That is again in the context of understanding. You cannot understand with the mind, so be content to feel from the psychic and the intuitive. From a certain perspective, we can look at it this way. If at each moment the universe is being recreated entirely, what prevents the next moment to be completely different in form? In principle, nothing prevents it. The next moment, this mountain here could be turned into an ocean. Right? But that power to be able to have that kind of a radical change instantaneously belongs to the supermind, because it is that which organizes the form of the universe as it is unfolding. So when the supramental consciousness becomes entirely active in life, it would have the power to do such things also. But doesn't mean it will do it. Because at that point it acts by the divine will. And where the divine will chooses to do that, it could do it equally. But such would be the power of the supermind even in material circumstances, when it is active in matter. At present, it is most active in the mind. And in the mind, it is able to do that. So, Mother describes when there is a supramental intervention, three characteristics she says. First, its action is on a large scale. Suddenly, a large number of people suddenly have a shift of their thinking. Second, it has an instantaneous change which is almost miraculous, which is miraculous. So overnight, suddenly the whole thinking of the whole group has changed, of an entire country or a group of countries. And third, although the change is miraculous, it seems to be the most natural, and you do not find it surprising at all. So when the Soviet Union collapsed as an institution, and suddenly there was this new status of all those countries, overnight, literally. That was one example of such an action. Suddenly, overnight, everybody said, okay, this is the most obvious thing. And nobody saw in it something extraordinary. When just a few days before, if you had asked them, do you think it can happen? They would say, impossible. Everybody would have said impossible. Something similar things have been happening over the world in special occasions where large numbers have suddenly just changed the way they thought, and suddenly overnight things changed. And it was miraculous in the way it happened, against all odds, against all systems. It's as if whatever opposition was there suddenly became irrelevant. So these three characteristics she describes. And this is because in the domain of the mind, the supermind is already more directly active, not yet completely. But when such a similar directness comes in the life force, such a similar directness can come in the material working of the supramental consciousness, you would have as radical a change even in material circumstances, potentially possible.
Our question is that then the demons of God, in spite of having a physical connection for some duration, again mankind or we fall into that group. So actually, is that the motivation is not there? What is
But why do you say there is a connection? Where is the connection?
Connection of our e-learning psychic results?
Okay.
That we keep for, say, for example, 1 or 2 hours, 5 hours, like that, whatever.
The connection.
Again, falling back into that.
The connection is only from a small part of our being to the divine. The huge, larger parts are not yet experiencing that connection. And therefore, when they are active, suddenly we are a different person. When they are passive and this very small, little, quiet part has an occasion to be able to feel and assert its connection, we are a different person. But that's how we start. Eventually, when that connection forms in all the parts, then we will not have this kind of a shift anymore.
At present, the other parts are not having any motivation or like that.
Partly, they are unable to be aware of the divine consciousness, and partly they have the huge habit of the past. These are the two things which prevent. And that's why there is a gradual cultivation of our nature, starting from some center which has that contact and that aspiration, and it has to extend its influence in other parts. And that's why there is a whole period of training to control your thoughts, control your desires, control your speech, control your actions, consciously cultivate benevolence, goodwill, positive thinking, etc., etc., and somehow bring the glow of that central part into those other parts. Initially, one can do these things almost as a discipline where we impose a form on our nature. But if we stop with that, the nature hasn't changed. We have just become good imitators, good pretenders, and very often perhaps hypocrites. So the real change takes place when something of the psychic influence can penetrate those parts, and then those parts genuinely feel the joy of this higher aspiration, this higher turn, or even they can feel the presence of the divine or the joy of relating or aspiring to the divine. Then it becomes real. And after that, it can become almost effortless because all those parts are craving for it. And the relapse becomes less often or almost impossible. So there's a period of cultivation. That's why all spiritual disciplines start with basic regulations of do's and don'ts. And that sets a base of a background. In our community here, and the blame does not go to our masters but to the human beings who join the community, we have conveniently done away with many of these things and tried to simplify our understanding to make it deceptively simple that we just pray, we just aspire, and everything else will happen automatically. But if you see, when the mother established the ashram, there was a very rigorous discipline. It's only when the children came that discipline was slackened for the children and the parents who were not here for sadhana. Subsequently, the mother told the children that I am going to teach you how to cultivate your consciousness, cultivate your nature, and prepare yourself for a higher life. 5 years down the line, one of the children asked the mother, "Mother, you said 5 years ago that you would teach us. It's not yet happened." Mother said, "That's what I've been doing the last 5 years." But she was doing it with so gently, with so much affection, and not at all in the sense of do this, do that. Because she said the moment you put a rule, it has its own other problems. But just describing what's possible, leaving it to them to take the initiative, that they didn't even realize what was happening. You will see an entire volume of her talks which involve her commentaries on the Dhammapada, taken from the Buddhist text, which set these basic principles of organizing our life: self-control, self-discipline, control of thought, mastery of thought, etc., control of desires. All these things are part of that. And she was studying them not merely as a time pass, but because it was intended to be practiced by the students as well as, of course, by the disciples. But somehow we tend to ignore all those things because they are inconvenient to practice. So, because we do not have a regimentation, it's easy to set that aside. And one of the popular ways by which these things are discarded is by saying, oh, we have gone beyond morality and ethics, and therefore it doesn't count. But that's not true. Until we have a consciousness which is already above morals and ethics, we have to respect the ethics and morality and use them as a means to transcend to a higher consciousness. We don't have that consciousness yet. And that's where all the discipline and training comes.
And in the last the teacher, he said that at the age of 5, cycling was in front and then and then last say, it will not happen to you just like that. You are how many years before 5 years? Kind of.
Yes.
It will not happen just like that.
Yes. And the advantage, though, is here there is a tremendous pressure of a power that will help, even which pushes you in that direction. And she said, normally, to realize the psychic being in the circumstances elsewhere in the world would take up to 30 years typically. But here it can be done within 9 or 10 months because of this pressure and this help. And so we have to take advantage of that. And part of the responsibility we have collectively is to conserve and preserve this presence and power which he has established here, and not to dilute it, not to frivolously disperse or spend it. And there's a lot of that also happening currently. Yes, it requires an effort. Yes. But in terms of conserving that, preserving that power, even if we are aware of it and respectful of it, just that provides a ground on which she can hold it easily. It's only when we waste that the power begins to withdraw. If you are aware and respect that power and presence, already that's enough for her to keep it and even to intensify it.
And didn't really understood how that done. Recently I discovered this type of answer practice. The tradition from walking is this thing a good thing to pursue rather than just
There's a talk by the mother, one of the classes she took, where she deals with this question. She describes several methods of drawing in the universal vitality, and then she says, but it is best to receive the energy from above, from the divine consciousness, because that is the more superior form of the energy. So you can take it in this way. There are exercises by which you can draw energy from around, from the universal life energy. There are exercises, incidentally, which I've seen in the New Age groups for drawing energy from below the feet, from the earth, which I personally consider to be of a very low grade of energy, but somehow they seem to think it's wonderful and great. But it's much better already when you draw from around, because it is a more free and clearer energy. But when you can draw from above, that is actually a spiritual energy which can function as a life force but with much more other benefits and results spiritually. So for drawing from around, I would straight away describe three things. One, basic pranayama exercises. Sri Aurobindo refers to this in The Brain of India. You can reread that portion where he says one has to develop the capacity to hold energy and then to purify the passage of universal energy to reach us. And for the holding energy, it is the practice of brahmacharya, and for purifying the passages, it is this practice of the breathing. So you can reread that portion and even basic pranayama exercises. Second, you will find Mother describing this method of, let's say, lying down on the terrace or sitting in front of the ocean and allowing your own consciousness to open to that wideness. And automatically that allows a more direct exchange of energy. Your littleness opens to the wideness. A third exercise is more direct, more specific to the form of the integral yoga, if I may say so, where you look at what it is you're doing when you do the pranayam or when you do this exercise of opening to the sky or the ocean or visualizing, etc. What you're doing is there is this circumconscient, the limit of your physical, narrow, egocentric egg of individuality. And the whole ocean of energy is out there. What blocks you from receiving it is this barrier of I versus not I. You can directly act on the state of your consciousness, of your relationship with the universal energy, of the outside with the inside. Shift that state, change it, and you will find you can just spontaneously open to that energy. Draw from it as you want, leave it pouring in or limit it to the extent you want, and channel it directly into work, and even reduce it just by willing it directly. All of the earlier two exercises would be useful to bring you to this degree of awareness where you can directly intervene on the barrier which separates the individual from the universal and draw in this way. If in the process, in all three exercises, you put your higher focus, or you put your focus on the energy from above and put greater emphasis on that, you could, in the second or third exercise, do it in a meditative state, drawing on the energy from above, and so reach that result. But I think this is a broad enough framework in which you can explore and experiment. The exercise itself was to a large extent organized. The system was organized by Udar and the exercises were developed by Pranab. And following Mother's guidance, the way the exercises are structured, you are made to do everything. There's a system and structure for what is natural for the body's rhythms. But the idea is, in that overall framework, you end up doing everything. All the parts of the body and all the possible functionings are touched somehow. And this creates the maximum amount of plasticity. If all of this you could do with a deeper awareness of why you're doing it, then you would have a spiritual impact on the body consciousness. Unfortunately, as students, we don't have that awareness and we miss that opportunity. By the time we have that awareness, we look back and we say, oh, I wish I had it then. But if you catch the principle, you don't have to follow exactly those exercises. You could even do a basic set of asanas. You could even do a basic set of activities which include walking or cycling or just going up and down the stairs. But do it with that kind of awareness. And the spiritual result would be there for the body consciousness. Mm-hmm. Yes, when you see it as energy, energy is always moving. What you call a fixed form is whirling energy, right? From the energy's perspective, there is only movement. There is no static energy at all. Static energy is moving in the same round and round. So the appearance on the physical form is fixed, but the reality behind is the moving energy. Aha, okay, okay. Where is the energy moving, if you think about it? In space, right? But where is the space? Have you felt it? What you're seeing out there is only what you perceive in your mind's eye, isn't it? You don't know if right now you are plugged in into the matrix and a computer is creating an illusion for you. Maybe there is nothing out there, right? Exactly. So you can say the movement is in the mind, and there is no real movement out there. It is only the mind which moves. But that's the point. That is a truth, an experience. It's not the whole experience. It's a liberating experience because at that point you can subjectively be free from all the problems of the world. But you have not solved the problems. You've just become free inside you. I am not affected anymore. So we had just recently, there was a conference where there was a Buddhist on one side. On the other side, there was a Jewish Vedantin. And the Buddhist said, oh, all these problems, nature's, the degradation of the ecological problems and the uh, global climate change and the poisoning of the waters, the banks which are looting the people and the whole breakdown of the economic and social structures. All of these problems can be solved only one way: change yourself. You have to observe in your mind and change your mind, and suddenly you will find there is no problem. Okay, this is the Buddhist position. And then the Jews are much more practical in their action in the world. And he's a Jewish Vedantin. He said, that's a wonderful thing. All the bankers will tell you, yes, please go ahead and change yourself. Meanwhile, we will continue to loot you and take away your money and destroy the environment. So you have to act. So there's always an objective action in the domain of life which is required. And that's going to be the emphasis in this next paragraph, where in relation to the universe, the supreme is Brahman. And then we look at the whole universe as the field in which this divine has to be manifested. Subjectively, in the individual, the divine has to be manifested in us, through us. We are vehicles for the divine consciousness. But in the universe, objectively, also the divine has to be manifested. And so that's the next step. Yes.
I'm thinking of all these comments that change yourself, yes, but in terms of an individual and the fiction of the universal, for the whole thing to change radically, a lot of individuals wanting to do that instead after this movie.
Yes. And you can't say at that point that all that is happening in my mind and I can change my mind. You have to accept the reality of the life force and matter out there. You have to deal with them externally. Perhaps from a changed state of mind, which gives you the power to deal with them. So these are complementary truths. You can't just take one side and say, I won't bother with the other. Nor can you say, I will go out there and change the world, as so many are trying to do, and they can't change the system because their approach is from a mindset which belongs to the old system. Their mind has to change from a new consciousness, from a new vision, a new understanding and perception of things. You can change systems. But if you try change only on the basis of an old consciousness, it doesn't work. If you try change subjectively without bothering with the external, then also it does not work. You need to do both. And so each helps the other. And gradually, collectively, there is an awakening that takes place as more and more of us individually ramp up our internal state and our external action. We help the collective also similarly to rise with us. That's why the whole thing takes time.
every time I say one of those things about prayer, because actually wanted to make it make sense of prayer. That's the issue. So, usually, I remember when I put music, I was writing it down. I was writing one of your messages about the on paper. And I actually found that was a miracle.
Yes. Yes.
And the reason I defend it is because when, one of the biggest parts of their life, I believe that the mother knows that anything you can do. So the thing is that if you make me feel that you feel a form to mother, then you have that you
Yes. It's very important to distinguish between problems where you can play a role and problems where you cannot play a physical or material role. In the problem of the Chinese invasion, obviously mother couldn't tell Satyen, go and fight on the borders. There's nothing he can do sitting here except pray. And there, the only thing you can do is to pray. But she didn't say that to the generals on the border. To them, she gave a blessing packet and said, go, take over this place quickly, do not delay. So in the Bangladesh war, her advice to Indira Gandhi was, do not delay one moment, go immediately. And to the generals who were in touch with her, she said, do not go head-on conflict, bypass where there are entrenched soldiers, bypass and go straight for Dhaka. So there was a column which went right through to Dhaka, took over Dhaka, and then the whole thing was finished in a few days. And it was a miracle. They said militarily it was impossible. So where you are part of the system and you can play a role, you have to act. And yes, you pray for help for the action which you have to do. And even I would say pray for the right guidance to understand what's the right thing you should do, because very often you might help doing the wrong thing without realizing it. You might be a cause for more problem. Where you cannot physically intervene, then you can subtly intervene, and there the best way is through prayer, putting out thoughts of goodwill, positive support, etc. But you can't say everybody in the world should sit back and pray and things will change. That won't happen. Yes.
One point I came to see is that actually
yes. Yes, you're right. You're right.
So in this way, then I feel she makes me do
yes.
what I should do, and arranges the forces around
yes.
me. And when I mentioned I agree with you.
Yes.
That way you're not passive, but you
yes.
are doing.
I remember there was, when I was working in the archives almost 20 years ago, there was one lady from the ashram, I think her name is Ananta. She was very active in promoting India-Pakistan harmony. And she had these huge sheets in which, she, as an artist, she would draw these verses in Arabic script. I don't know what they were exactly, but I think they were texts from the mother and Sri Aurobindo, and she would get them photocopied and send them to people they distribute and things like that. I don't know if physically she made any significant difference, but on a subtle level, I'm sure she made an enormous difference. Although the action physically may have appeared small, the subtle action, the energy that she poured into it, etc., the sheer goodwill, I'm sure it would have had an immense result which would build to the eventual outcome which may still take place a few years down the line. And so everything counts, even the good thoughts that we put out. For our own life, though, if we put out constantly positive thoughts of our own spiritual purpose, these things also help to build a focus and a concentration for that outcome. Oh. Om.